Let me get started. Let me welcome you all to the Woodrow Wilson Center. I'm impressed that so many of you have braved the heat in August, and it's a tribute, of course, to a very good book, which I think will trigger a very spirited discussion. And I also want to welcome those of you who are watching on the web. I'm Kent Hughes. I run a program here at the center on America and the global economy. And I'm, of course, among other things, look at the long-run future of the American economy, and Pinched, today's discussion, has some challenging views about what that future is and what we might do about it. For those of you who are new to the center, let me give you just a brief background about who we are and what we intend to do. When Congress was looking around to honor Woodrow Wilson, they finally decided against another marble statue or another monument, and instead created this living memorial. As you may know, Wilson was the only president to have earned a PhD. And in creating this living memorial, Congress gave it the assignment of bringing together both sides of Wilson's life. The academic side, as you may know, he was a prominent academic, a very well-known political scientist, went on to be president of Princeton, to bring together that policy research side of his life, together in Washington with the people who are making or influencing policy. And since we've grown, we really try to take that message not only here, but around the country, and to some extent, we do some work overseas as well. Well, today, it is our pleasure to welcome Don Peck, who did a good deal of effective writing here. I'm delighted to say it's great to point to his book, a product of his time here at the Wilson Center. Don is currently the features editor at The Atlantic magazine, for which he, in addition to commissioning features and writing a good deal himself, you really keep your eye on most of the economic side of The Atlantic. He was quite well known for an earlier essay on which the book, in fact, is based, called The Recession's Long Shadow. And I'm told that this was quite widely circulated in the White House, and I may ask Don a question or two about that as we go along. Before joining The Atlantic, he was with the Advisory Board Company, a strategic advisory group. He comes with a distinguished academic background, a BA from Dartmouth in government, and as he says, modified by economics. And speaking as an economist, I've come to realize that economics needs to be occasionally modified by a bit of political science. He also has an MA from the Woodrow Wilson School in Princeton. We thought we'd do it a little differently today. Going to ask Don to give an overview of his book and present the general thesis and so forth. And then I'd start with a small list of questions myself and then turn to you all for your questions. So Don, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Kent. And first, I want to thank Kent and the Wilson program for their help and support throughout the writing of this book. It's a challenge to write about something that's still unfolding, and Wilson kindly gave me an office and a bit of research support for the 6 months book leave that I had from The Atlantic to do much of the research for this book. Without the Wilson Center support, it really wouldn't have happened. So many thanks. I'd like to keep this pretty informal and hopefully have a lot of Q&A. So let me give just a kind of a quick overview. So as Kent said, I cover the economy for The Atlantic, most of which means I look for stories and authors who can write them. And around the springtime in 2009, when everyone was kind of catching their breath and thinking, well, the economy isn't going to evaporate altogether, I was talking to quite a few economists who said to me, we're kind of breathing a premature sigh of relief. Most of the labor economists that I talked to at that time thought we would be in for a very long labor recovery, and that the economy was actually likely to remain weak for quite some time, in part because that's simply the nature of the aftermath of major financial crises. At the same time, I became familiar with the work of Lisa Kahn, an economist at Yale, who's done a lot of work looking at how young people, young adults in particular, are usually impacted by recessions, particularly long, deep recessions. What she had found was that there really was a lifelong impact for people just coming onto the job market in recession. Not only did they start out behind, they quite literally never caught up. After 5, 10, 15, 20 years through booms and busts, people who had begun their careers in recession were permanently scarred by them, in part because the first few years of a job on the job market are simply so critical to establishing one's career track. And when one starts in a bad job or with no job, even if it's really the result of the economy, employers tend to look askance at that and begin to suspect some form of underachievement. You know, what Kahn found was that 20 years later, people who'd come out after the '81 recession were disproportionately in non-professional jobs, well behind on income, and that they clung more tightly to their careers. The experience of the recession itself seemed to have changed them, made them more personally conservative, arguably in ways that harmed their careers. So I started talking to economists and sociologists and reading histories of the 70s, the Great Depression, the late period of the Gilded Age, the late 19th century, when times were tough for many, many years, when incomes were not growing, when unemployment was high, to try to start thinking about whether this experience for young people was in any way more generalizable. I mean, in other words, we think of recessions as temporary, and we think of jobs lost that are later regained, housing values that go down and later go back up. But what I started seeing in my reading and in my conversations with various scholars was that in many ways, long, deep recessions leave permanent changes, permanent scars on society that do not soon go away. Once the economy recovers, once the unemployment rate comes back down, society is nonetheless changed in meaningful ways. I spoke a little bit about young people and how their income paths and career paths are changed, but the character of up-and-coming generations also typically change in times like this. Glenn Elder, a sociologist at the University of North Carolina, followed the lives of people of different ages during the Depression for decades thereafter. And what he found was, for young people in particular, young men in particular, in fact, women didn't seem to bear long-lasting psychological scars, but for men in particular, the hardship they suffered in the Depression, again, I'm talking really specifically about people in their 20s, stayed with them for a lifetime. They became, even at age 60, they displayed a fatalism, a sense of lack of agency, a sense of powerlessness before the fates that different age groups did not have, that men who did not experience hardship in their 20s also did not experience. So the book that I've written does two things. It does three things, sorry. It looks broadly at how society is changing, how the places we live, the work we do, our family lives, and even who we are has already been changed by the recession, and how it's likely to change in the coming years. It looks as well at the various deep economic trends that recessions such as this one tend to actually speed up. And then it looks at how we can recover more broadly from this period. I mean, I think a lot of the commentary about the recession, the jobs recession, today is kind of fatalistic and hopeless. And one of the main messages of the book is it doesn't need to be. I mean, this is a tough period. We're not going to recover from it next month or next year, but there are a lot of actions we can take to speed our recovery. Let me talk just for a couple of minutes about each of those things. So how are we going to be left kind of permanently changed by this recession? I've talked a little bit about young people. I want to talk as well about the most severe problem that I see in this recession right now, and that is the problem of the chronically unemployed. The average duration of unemployment is over 9 months right now. It's the longest ever recorded since the Bureau of Labor Statistics started recording that statistic in I believe 1948. And there are millions of people who have been out of work for a year or 2 years or more. That number is growing with each month that we stay in this period. Now, companies have begun to hire again, but interestingly, a lot of ads have started to appear that say in one fashion or another, no unemployed candidates will be considered for this position. The ads often disappear once the media calls attention to them, but new ones keep appearing, and this seems to be a widespread and growing phenomenon. In part that simply reflects the fact that it's still a buyer's market for employers. But my fear is that it portends something more permanent as well. Temporary unemployment tends to become permanent after a time. People's skills deteriorate, their social networks shrink, so they simply are not aware of jobs and cannot get personal recommendations. Their behavior may change. A recent Rutgers study indicates that more than half of people surveyed who've been out of work for 7 months or more recently had begun to pull away from friends, were having strained family situations. About 15% had developed substance abuse problems. And whether or not there is real personal dysfunction among the long-term unemployed, companies simply begin to ignore them en masse. The risk is that over time, the economy, somewhat shrunken, will simply move on without these people, and the unemployment rate will be left permanently higher. That's what happened in Europe to some extent in the 80s and 90s. I'm happy to go into this in greater detail later, and it's a real risk for us right now. The longer people spend out of the job market, the harder it is for them to get back in. So if we continue to see unemployment rates like we see today for another year or so, it's going to become harder and harder to bring those rates down without specific and concerted action to help the long-term unemployed. Let me talk just for a moment about the ways in which this recession is accelerating trends that were already happening in the economy as well. The things I've mentioned for the most part are just long-running consequences of particularly bad economic periods. But in this recession, as has happened in the past, we're also seeing certain economic trends sped up temporarily. Companies have used this recession to restructure their operations, to offshore work quickly that they otherwise might have taken several years to offshore as attrition and retirement allowed. They've substituted technology more aggressively, again, tending to more quickly change the workforce. David Autor, an economist at MIT, did a detailed study of the specific nature of jobs lost in this recession. And what he found was an interesting and I think worrying pattern. Now, of course, jobs should have been growing throughout the economy to accommodate a growing population throughout the recession. But what he found was among high-skilled jobs, professional and managerial jobs, the jobs typically undertaken by people with a college or graduate degree, there was no net reduction in jobs in the U.S. economy, none. At the bottom of the economy, in low-skilled jobs such as food preparation, security, personal services, and the like, there was also essentially no net reduction in jobs. Overwhelmingly, the job losses in this recession have been in the middle. What Autor calls middle-skill jobs undertaken by people typically with a high school degree but not a four-year college degree. The kinds of jobs in manufacturing, for instance, and in non-managerial office work, clerking, administrative assistants, and the like, that have really formed the bulk of the true middle class in the U.S. Adults with a high school degree but not a four-year college degree make up about 60% of the adult population. And this recession has accelerated the hollowing of the middle class and pressed down hard on that group of people. At the same time, it's really the other side of the coin. It has accelerated, again, temporarily. These aren't permanent trends. The movement of the U.S. towards what a couple of Citibank analysts called in 2006 a plutonomy, an economy in which the rich and affluent really dominated. From 2002 to 2007, the top 1% of earners captured $2 out of every $3 of new income growth in the U.S. In recession, they lost much less than the middle class, in part because housing values plummeted so precipitously and have not recovered, while the stock market, the last couple of days notwithstanding, has substantially recovered. And the affluent and rich have actually come out of recession faster by a variety of metrics than anyone else. The entirety of the consumer recovery in the last 2 years, such as it is, seems to have been driven by the affluent, the top 20% of society. Spending among everyone else has been completely flat. So in this recession, we're not just seeing a bad period, which is leaving scars on the unemployed, leaving scars on young people. We're also seeing an acceleration of some trends that I find worrying for American society, trends that are occurring for deep reasons of globalization and technological change, and that I think this recession has shown, are unlikely to abate anytime soon. I talk in the book about solutions to the problems that we're seeing in this recession. And really, when you look at the range of problems that we're seeing in this period, those solutions need to be wide and varied. I think in the short run, briefly, we do need to see fiscal expansion. We do need to see targeted increases in government spending, aid to states, continued support to the unemployed, an emphasis on infrastructure spending and the jobs that can create. And unfortunately, we seem to be seeing a move towards austerity and contraction right now. History shows us this is a terrible idea. In the Depression in 1936, most Americans concerned about years of budget deficits came to believe, surveys show, that the U.S. absolutely had to balance its budget, its federal budget. And so the federal government did cut spending and raise taxes rather dramatically, and the market tanked again. Unemployment rose again to 19%, and it took 5 more years really for the economy to recover. I'm not suggesting that we're seeing something similar to that this week, but it is true, I think, that one thing the market is responding to is the signal that the federal government is going to begin withdrawing its support for the economy very soon. In the longer term, there are a host of other things we need to do. The backbone of every economy is, the backbone of the U.S. economy and any rich economy is technological progress and breakthrough innovations. For a variety of reasons, the rate of breakthrough innovations had been very disappointing throughout the aughts. With the housing bubble, we just didn't notice. And so that's one reason why this period has been so tough and may remain so. There aren't the kinds of big breakthroughs occurring in the economy that we saw in the 90s. And I think there are a variety of measures that we can take to try to jumpstart that growth from a light regulatory hand on particularly on small industries, new industries that might provide a burst of job growth, to greater investment in science and R&D, to simply letting in more high-skilled entrepreneurial immigrants who can create companies and jobs more quickly. Let me pause here. I think that those are the sorts of solutions. I've only mentioned a few of them actually that I would see kind of helping us get out of this period more quickly. There are a range of other things we can do to try to increase geographic mobility, which is important, and simply to support people who have been felled by this recession. But let me pause. Let me just stop here and turn it over to Ken for questions and to the audience.
Thank you, Don. That's very good overview, challenging perspective, some potential promise in your solutions. Let me start with asking you about the earlier essay on which the book is based, and you mentioned that it had been circulated. Your bio mentions that it's been circulated in the White House. What was their reaction? Do you see their proposals and policies reflecting the challenges that you spell out in the book?
I think that from my both from back channel conversations I've had and then from conversations with people in the White House, there were two things that were primarily of interest to different people in the White House. I mean, the biggest was just when the article came out. I think a lot of people, including President Obama, were interested in the idea that we often underestimate the true costs of staying in incredibly weak periods like this because we don't fully consider the permanent effects that periods like this are likely to have on young people, on people who lose their jobs and can't find new jobs, and on communities that are characterized by high unemployment. Those communities tend to devolve quickly, and it's hard for them to recover. So that was simply, I think, one thing that was interesting to the White House, and I think that the White House wanted to consider in thinking about the aggressiveness of the response. A second thing that Larry Summers in particular was interested in, and which he views as one of the main long-term problems facing the U.S. Was, and I haven't really talked about this, the other long-term trend that the recession has sped is the employment problems of men without college degrees in the economy, and Summers was very interested in that. Since 1970, as manufacturing began to decline in a relative sense, men have struggled. Wages for men with only a high school degree or less have fallen over that time, and men have been slowly exiting the workforce. Well, I believe, and I shouldn't do this from memory because I don't have the statistics at the top of my fingers, but I believe among prime age men with a high school degree but not a college degree, in around 1970, 95% of such men were working, and I believe now that figure is around 70 or 75%. Over 40 years, a meaningful minority of men have really struggled. Women have kept getting more and more education, men have not. College attainment is no different now than it was in 1980 for men. It's quite a lot different for women. Men have also struggled to move from blue-collar work into the services, things like education and healthcare, which are growing rapidly. This recession was called the man-cession. It's a bit of a cliche, but it's true. About 3/4 of all job losses were to men. That's always true to some extent because construction and manufacturing are highly cyclical. But again, a lot of those jobs are not likely to come back. Summers was very worried about what declining labor force participation meant for blue-collar men, because what we know is that women tend not to marry men who are jobless or who are economically struggling, but they do have children with them. And there's abundant sociological research to show this. So what we're seeing in a lot of blue-collar and working-class communities now are changes in family structure as women become the economic center of households. There's nothing in itself that's bad about that, of course, but that is changing families, and it's leading to more single-parent households, and over time, that can create problems for children and for the communities in which those children reside. So the worry is, when you look at the problems facing blue-collar men, what that does to blue-collar families, and how that changes blue-collar communities. Summers' worry is that, and I don't want to put words on in his mouth, but his worry seems to be, and certainly my worry is, that you may see kind of a self-reinforcing pattern where reasonably large parts of society struggle, and where opportunity for children is very different in those communities than it is in communities like professional Washington, D.C. Finally, sorry, this is a long answer. Kent asked, how policies have responded. I was never privy to the specific discussions that the White House was having here. My sense, though, from other reporting mostly, is that many of the economic advisors in the White House from 2009 up until very recently had been pushing for a bigger stimulus initially, and more government support for the states. The payroll tax cut, other measures that might juice demand while consumers are rebuilding their personal portfolios. Tim Geithner, who has been an extremely powerful figure in the White House and has the ear of Obama, it has been reported, has been reluctant to undertake those measures, and has been pushing, as I understand it, for essentially for austerity, and it seems, we can see what's happened to government policy. They did pass a few things at the end of 2010 to try to create a little new stimulus, but certainly we do seem to be moving towards a more contractionary phase now.
I wanted, before opening it up to everyone else, I wanted to return to your mention of the word plutonomy. That as part of that chapter, you talked about the emergence, or really a global elite that has emerged, including many at the very top in the United States, who really no longer see themselves as principally tied to any particular nation state. They are very global in their view. You quoted one as saying, well, if we bring 4 or 5 Indians or Chinese up into the middle class and it knocks one American out, maybe that's a good bargain. Do you find this an emerging trend? And if so, do we need to really think who we follow in terms of the elite?
Yeah, absolutely. I was last year. I was out at the Aspen Ideas Festival, which is a kind of a week-long colloquy of generally affluent, generally rich people, really, on kind of big ideas, technological ideas, and big public affairs issues. And I heard this kind of comment over and over again. There was Bill Gates was one of the featured guests at the conference, and Walter Isaacson, the president of the Aspen Institute, kicked off an interview with him by asking what he was optimistic about. And Gates replied very easily. He said, I'm optimistic about most things. And he went on to list them. Global poverty was falling. Health advances had been rapid in the developing world. Technological progress worldwide was rapid. He just didn't really mention the U.S. And the view that we should look broadly at human advance and increasing wealth globally is morally laudable. It's logically unimpeachable. To a large extent, this era, globally, what we're seeing is the rise of the middle class, just not ours. But this attitude is also very liberating for U.S. business people, U.S. business executives, who I've found really frequently do have this view and are quite happy. I don't want to say they're happy. They first of all, they're responding to challenges that they need to respond to, but they can justify that quite easily because they say, well, I'm moving jobs overseas. It's helping people overseas. The improvement is greater than the loss in the U.S. So I think that's an important thing to note, and I think that when we look at the interests of business and the interests of American workers. You know, they've never been the same thing, but to one extent or another, you know, it's always been very important to American businesses that we have a well-educated workforce and that the economy domestically is healthy and so on and so forth. That's still important, but it's decidedly less important than it used to be. So you know, I have nothing but respect for the people who are starting and running, you know, large companies in the U.S. today. But I do think we need to take their advice and their comments with a grain of salt, because again, their interests and the interests of the U.S. broadly are perhaps less aligned than they used to be.
Well, let me open up. Steve, let me start with you, and please introduce yourself.
My name is Stephen Short. Wonderful presentation. I have two brief questions. The first is, it seems, although you didn't say so explicitly, that as opportunities that were formerly denied to women are largely but hardly completely removed, that it may be that women will become, at least in the United States, the natural breadwinner, whereas during the Depression, men often felt ashamed because they couldn't provide for their family. But it seems almost an irreversible trend in the United States that women, with their better retention rates in graduating from college and the fresh opportunities open, will become the primary breadwinner. And I was wondering how this might affect the future of the American family. And my second question is, you seem to describe the Great Recession as a kind of anomaly, dashing expectations that the assumption were normal expectations. But what if you take the opposite point of view, if the expectations in the most recent prosperity were inflated and irrational, and that what is happening now in the minds of those unemployed for whatever period are a more natural assumption, that perhaps a extended recession is more of the natural order, and the prosperity which preceded it and hopefully will follow it was the aberration?
Great questions. Let me take the second one first. Yes, I mean to some extent, the recession, you know, broadly speaking, was the result of overly optimistic, you know, assumptions about the U.S. economy. You know, as I said, the last decade has been really disappointing for innovation, you know, generally, for a variety of reasons, and the middle class at the same time, you know, the non-professional middle class, you know, was being affected all along by globalization, by technological substitution. You know, wages across the U.S. Were completely flat for the last decade, and we're moving downwards for many people. But the housing bubble kind of papered all of that over for years, and people may not have been seeing improvements to their paychecks, but they thought they were getting wealthier, and they spent like it. And you know, the ratio of debt to GDP, consumer debt to GDP, I believe, was about 85% in the mid-90s. It rose to 130% in 2007. It's only come down to about 120, 118% since then. So we've got a long way to go. I mean, when you think about this recession, it really can't be separated from the revolution in trade and technology that we've been seeing recently. In many ways, it was the denouement of that revolution. So this is a long period of correction, you know, where people have recalibrated expectations. They're paying down debt. They're rebuilding their portfolios. They're not spending aggressively, and they can't. There's good reason for that. So that in itself is one reason why this has lasted so long already, and is perhaps likely to keep, you know, lasting longer. And I think it highlights the importance of trying to fix those those bedrock problems. It's not just about fiscal stimulus today. We really do need to invigorate innovation, and we also need to find ways to help people who do not have college degrees, the non-professional middle class, build skills and find better jobs. A lot of the last chapter of my book looks at ways that we can do that. A 4-year college degree is simply not the answer to the woes of the non-professional middle class. We just can't get enough people through college fast enough for that to be true. The math just doesn't work. Your first question about men and women is an interesting one, and I don't want to speak too confidently about it, but I do agree with much of what you've said. I mean, we can say, just based on the last 30 or 40 years, that what's happened is, as manufacturing has declined and as the service sector has arisen, and as education has become more and more important, the fortunes of men have continually declined. The fortunes of women have continually increased. Now, women still make less than men on average, in large or in some part, probably in large part, because of lingering discrimination. I am not in any way saying that issue has gone away, or that we should, try to help men at the expense of women. It's wonderful to see the strides that women have made in education and in the economy, and there's every sign that that's going to continue. That's great news. But it is true that for whatever reason, a meaningful minority of men have not responded to market signals, not just in the past 2 years, but in the past 30 years. Men haven't gotten more education. They haven't moved into the services. Is that for cultural reasons? Is there some element of genetic reasons? I have no idea. I'm sure a lot of it is cultural, but there are a lot of people who are beginning to speculate that a post-industrial economy is at some level more congenial to women, than to men. That's certainly not true right now at the top of society, but it is apparent in the middle and towards the lower end, where women, often already are really the economic anchors of society. Now, I think over time, I hope that over time, everyone will adjust to that, and we'll begin to see families that are intact, where the women maybe are the center of them economically, and men are doing more childcare and household help and things like that, and that those will be happy circumstances. In a lot of blue-collar families, men already are doing a lot of childcare and a lot of housework. Women in those sorts of families where the woman is the primary breadwinner, tend to be very happy with the childcare that their partner, it's usually not a husband, it's usually a partner, provide. On balance, they tend to be very unhappy with their relationships overall. So again, I mean, I think we're facing a family problem right now, which is that for whatever reason, gender identity is not as mutable as we might like to think it is, and or at least not as quickly changeable, and that is having a real and pernicious impact on a lot of families in kind of less educated America. I hope that changes over time, and I think it may well, but it's not going to change overnight, and these changes to family structure right now are going to have long-running implications for the next generation or two.
The gentleman here, and then the hand in the back is great. Yes, microphone's on its way. If you could identify yourself.
My name is Randall Doyle. I work in the State Department. I work in the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor. I do want to answer just quick, because I have two questions. I do want to mention one thing, that I was doing some work one time in Australia. I was in Tasmania, and they were trying to save the forest in Tasmania, which is the second biggest forest, tallest forest in the world other than our California redwoods. And I remember I was talking to somebody, and the converting all these hundreds of loggers, and basically what everybody was talking about was green jobs, tourism. And one of the reasons why there was such a violent backlash against the environmentalists trying to save the trees and everything, and the gentleman who was supportive of this also had told me that, listen, these guys, their whole identity as men, cutting down trees, very masculine, you know, this type of thing, which is just like auto workers wearing the windbreakers or steel workers wearing the windbreakers or what union they're in. This was being taken away from them, their identity. And they said, and he said, I remember he told me, he said, how the hell do you think these guys are going to feel when all of a sudden now they're driving a bus or a boat or working as a hotel clerk? That sense of who they are as a men is stripped away from them, and you're going to have blowback within society in this kind of a socioeconomic gender sense, you know. But anyway, that's one thing I ran into in a study. Two questions, very quick questions. One dealing with manufacturing wages. The other day I read about an automobile factory being built in Tennessee, and the baseline salary was $14. Now, I'm from Michigan, and as you know, the automobile industry has been ravaged. It's coming back a little bit, but it'll never be the same again. 80% of those jobs will be gone forever. But the wages, you know, talking about globalization, globalization has decompressed the wages this way and raised the wages of people in the developing world this way. But the problem for Americans is that if this is the new baseline salary of $14 an hour, then they have to come to the grips with the fact that their standard of living is going to be $14 an hour, not $28 an hour. This has, and you can see this politically, this upcoming election, you just wait, folks. It's going to be wild out there because all of a sudden you're going to have millions of people realizing no home, no vacations, this and that, just surviving paycheck to paycheck and everything. But number two I'd like to bring up to you is the manufacturing jobs. We had someone come to the State Department from Boston, and he was talking about, he had this thing, he was talking to us about the so-called American Renaissance of manufacturing. Now, some of us are from Michigan, Ohio, and we're looking at each other like, you know, what in the hell is this guy talking about? And as we started to bear down on the guy, this was all pie in the sky. We said, well, where are all these jobs all going to come from, these manufacturing jobs? Because you talked about green jobs and stuff. And then we come to find out that the Chinese and other countries are making all these solar panels and all this kind of stuff. We're not investing, as a country, we're not investing in these industries, okay? The government taking a leading role investing in these technologies, and it's slipping away from our fingertips. Now, if the green jobs don't seem to represent the future of this country, and the manufacturing we have is whittling away 1,000 jobs at a time, my God, where are we going to be at? And I wonder, you know, your research and writing of this book talks about these so-called new wages that Americans are basically going to get, and that's it because of global pressures. And manufacturing jobs, manufacturing basically is not really going to come back to some degree because with the rise of basically China, India, other countries, Brazil, what do we do? What are these 60% of adults that you've mentioned before, high school, no college? This could be a whole new world for them in an economic sense, and they're not going to be better off than their parents and generations before them. What do? Or
let me talk about two aspects of your comment and question. You know, you mentioned politics, and that's an important part of my book and of the period that we're living through right now. Benjamin Friedman, an economic historian at Harvard, wrote a great book called The Moral Consequences of Economic Growth, and in that book, you know, what he did is he looked at the long, deep history, you know, in the U.S. and Europe, and what he found fairly consistently was that long periods of economic stagnation, you know, where most people don't feel like they're getting ahead, slowly corrode kind of the liberal, I don't necessarily mean politically liberal, but, you know, the liberal values of society. Politics grow meaner as these periods extend beyond just a few years and begin to feel more generational. And aggressive public action of any sort becomes harder because all options are foreshortened by a poisonous environment and heavy discontent. So, and we're seeing that today. I agree. The longer we stay in this period, you know, the more likely we are to see it, to see that happen. I think there's a fear of kind of a rising populism today that may be justified. I think probably the larger risk over and above, a demagogue being elected president is simply that we will continue to kind of go guardrail to guardrail, flip back and forth between parties with all incumbents highly vulnerable and uncertain. And the American people will just keep trying to kind of switch, and that in itself can be kind of paralyzing for government. So that's a real problem, I think. Now, you talked about manufacturing and a renaissance in manufacturing. By many measures, depending on how you measure it, the U.S. is the second largest manufacturer in the world, and manufacturing output before the recession was actually growing pretty quickly. The U.S. is also the third largest farming nation in the world, but only 2% of people are employed as farmers. So I mean, I think people focus quite a lot on trade and offshoring, but I think the manufacturing story is really at least as much and probably more a story of technology. So we may see a manufacturing renaissance in the U.S. That's not the same as seeing a widespread increase in manufacturing jobs, and the jobs that manufacturing is likely to create, by and large, not exclusively, are likely to be, higher and higher skill jobs. So that doesn't necessarily help the group of people that we've been talking about. All that said, I don't think the future has to be, entirely gloomy for kind of people in the middle of the American economy. It's a tough time now. As you say, the jobs that have come back so far have been substantially lower wage than the ones that we lost. The data are imperfect there, but it certainly looks that way right now. You're hearing the McKinsey Global Institute came out with a very good report on job growth recently, and I was talking to some of the folks over there, and they said, actually, wages in India have risen enough, and American wages have fallen enough that we can really begin to think about onshoring some call center work again to depressed kind of blue collar communities. Is that good news or bad news? I guess it's good news, but it does show the extent to which our society is kind of separating economically. All that said, I do think we will find new opportunities in the long run for people without a college degree, in healthcare, in personal services, in kind of repair. There are a lot of potential jobs out there, and I think there's a lot that we can do to help young people, high schoolers, kind of find those jobs, acquire skills within them, which will lead to better products and services and higher wages for them. One thing that I think is very promising today. Again, I think to a large extent we've been really highly focused in the U.S. on trying to get more people to college. We do need to make sure that access to college is wide, but there's a budding movement called career academies, which mix classroom learning and essentially apprenticeships for people in high school. It's been a very promising program, particularly for young men who sometimes struggle with classroom discipline at that age, and these are programs that allow people who might not see a 4-year degree in their future to get real workplace experience, to see what it takes to get into a real career, and to kind of build skills both inside and outside the classroom to get there. So I mean, I think that's the sort of program that can help that can help the aspiring middle class and young people who want to get into it, and that can help young men in particular who might one day have simply gone to the factory and gotten a good manufacturing job that they could stay with for the rest of their lives. They can't do that now, but these sorts of programs can help them see early on. They can help them see real careers, whether they be traditionally masculine careers or careers in healthcare. They can see them, and they can see how to get into them more quickly.
Let's see, a lady way in the back, and then the gentleman in the blue shirt, and then the gentleman over here.
Cornelius Troup, and I edit a yearbook called Business Statistics. We have talked a lot about these rather difficult shifts that are taking place within the labor force, but I am also concerned with the fact that the overall level of wages, rather of compensation, in the last decade or so has simply failed to keep pace with gains in productivity. And the crude question is, how do we get business to cough up wages that are in line with productivity gains?
Yeah, no, that's an excellent question, and I'm not sure I have a good answer to it. I mean, you know, the fact is that as long as there's a reserve of international labor, you know, that is still kind of low wage, it's going to be it may be hard to do that. I mean, a lot of people on the left, and I think there's something to be said for this, you know, have argued that even though there are many economic inefficiencies traditionally associated with unions, with labor unions, and even though labor unions can actually be exclusionary and sometimes hurt some low-wage workers, that unions were a very important part of the labor story in the U.S., and they provided a political counterweight to business. You know, not only did they raise wages directly, but they promoted the sorts of policies that were generally friendly to labor. So a lot of people now on the left are making an argument that, and again, I think it's not something I've looked into closely myself, so I'm not sure how I feel about it. But you know, they're making an argument that for reasons of politics as much as direct economics, you know, we should think about promoting unions again, which might help narrow that gap between productivity gains and wages. I think that argument works well for non-tradable sectors. It's a tougher argument for tradable sectors. One thing that I think we can begin to do, and this doesn't really address so much the question of productivity. We've got the Earned Income Tax Credit already. It's been a very popular and very successful anti-poverty program. And I think there is really quite a lot of support on both the right and the left for policies that reward work and provide a social compact to everyone who is willing to work. And because we're seeing a more rapid hollowing of the middle class, a lot of people who have fallen perhaps irrevocably out of it because of this recession, and more people who are struggling to get into it. You know, I think there's a really good argument to be made for either extending the Earned Income Tax Credit more substantially to people without children, who it by and large does not cover right now, including young men, and perhaps for increasing the Earned Income Tax Credit as well. You know, this is a way of providing direct income support to lower skilled people and people who can't find middle skilled jobs, and it's something that I think we may you know need to support as a society more aggressively in the future.
Gentleman in the blue shirt was next, and then the gentleman over here, and then the distinguished lady here toward the front.
James Sang. This is kind of a second-order question. You talked about how high-skilled people have not been are traditionally not affected by these turndowns. In fact, if you look more carefully at young entry into high skills, these turndowns, do they have actually longer-term effects? I know a couple of very high-skilled people. In fact, my best friend's son, who's a very good computer scientist, first job is going to be at Microsoft, but in Cambridge, England. And I know somebody else who's going to work for Applied Materials in Beijing. And they're both Americans, by the way. So I'm wondering whether, as you worry about innovation and stuff like that, and for young people coming out, even on the high skill end, are there some interesting perturbations on their career paths?
Yeah, I mean, I think I mean, I think it is quite likely that the highest skilled. So talking about college graduates, I think it is quite likely that people from more exclusive schools, from selective schools, are likely to see a lower, are likely to see less permanent damage as a result of this. And I say that for a few reasons. The economic research that's been done in the U.S. By Lisa Kahn, particularly, and others, really doesn't allow us to differentiate in that way. But the economist Till von Wachter at Columbia has looked at Canadian data because for various reasons you can do more with that data. And what he found is that basically college graduates who went to the top schools and who clustered in majors in math and the sciences and the majors which tend to be kind of more in demand, didn't see permanent losses. They did catch up. It was the kind of the people beneath them that. Well, no.
The kind of problems they work on, the first problems you work on to get out of grad school.
Yeah. Well, all I'm saying. Yeah. Right. 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 No, all I'm saying with the Canadian data is we don't if we're looking at the past, we don't have a way of saying there aren't good economic studies on this. Canada might be a proxy, which might show, but I mean more generally, it's a great question. I'm not sure I do have a good answer for it. I mean, certainly. One benefit that you sometimes see in recessions is it does force people of all ages to be more entrepreneurial, both in a broad sense and quite literally. People spend time starting new companies, working collaboratively rather than joining big companies. That can lead to an improvement in the rate of technological growth. We'll have to see if that happens this time around.
Yes, the gentleman there with the.
Dan Liebman, I'm a writer. Yeah, the one thing that we haven't mentioned here is the deficit in the balance of trade. I believe manufacturing has dropped in all Western nations to 20% of GDP, but the one nation that survived this recession very well is Germany. And why? It's not even an innovative country at all. There are no Apples, no Samsungs, no Intels in Germany. They make standard products, maybe with a little bit of dash to it. But what we do note is that they're now the second largest exporter in the world, and they have a very good balance of trade. Mm-hmm. So it seems to me that that is the real solution, to bring purchasing power into the country to finance the domestic manufacturer rather than financing by credit. And it would seem to me that's the prime solution, but somehow it's not mentioned.
Well, let me say a couple things. I mean, first of all, Germany is a very interesting and in some ways very encouraging, case study. They as you say, they did not see the kind of rise in unemployment that the U.S. did, not even close. Their overall economic and productivity growth have been relatively low, but they've protected people, and fewer people have lost their jobs, and I think that's in periods like this one, for a short period of time at least, that's a trade-off worth making, because we know the permanent damage that job loss does to people. And I'm not an expert on Germany. I don't really talk about it very much in my book. My understanding is, they have a program, they have a job sharing program that encourages companies to split work among people when demand declines, rather than firing people outright. That seems to have a lot to recommend it, though it's not a cure-all. It won't help when companies are simply restructuring operations altogether to permanently eliminate jobs. But I think that's a tactic that is worthy of emulation. Germany has also benefited somewhat in a weird way from reunification and the incorporation of its own set of kind of essentially low-wage laborers, those in the East, and I don't think we should underestimate the effect to which that has actually helped them in terms of being able to kind of retain jobs. More generally, I mean, yes, we need to redress the trade balance. We need to export more. I think one way, I try to describe some ways in the book from increasing our rate of technological innovation, which can help us start new companies in new industries. That is typically associated with both stronger exports and stronger job growth, and I really do think it's a big part of the puzzle today. But yeah, I mean, I also think that we need to help young people build the skills in high school that will allow us to retain skilled manufacturing work. Germany does a really good job. And again, they have a lot of apprenticeship programs, but they do a really good job of getting young people into industry from a young age on kind of a part-time, or just see it basis, and this allows them to build the kinds of skills that allow them to keep kind of particularly high-skilled manufacturing jobs in Germany, and I think we'd be well advised to emulate that as well.
Let me just follow up, if I may, the gentleman's question about manufacturing. In a sense, manufacturing would be a proxy for really dealing with the trade deficit. If hypothetically the trade deficit were something on the order of $500 or $600 billion, which it certainly has been in the recent past, and much of that is made up of, to balance that, we would both be exporting more and, in a sense, exporting more to America. That is, we would be consuming more of what we produce here. And if we were at trade balance, or that were our goal, with, say, some $500 billion more of largely manufacturing production, even with the technological advances, wouldn't that translate into a lot, at least over a near-term period, a lot of those more traditional manufacturing jobs?
If we could achieve it, yes, it would. A part of the problem. Raghu Rajan, the University of Chicago economist, came out with a terrific book called Fault Lines, maybe about a year ago, and he makes the comment that what. I mean, this is not unique to him, but I mean, I think it's generally agreed that the biggest reason, that the real reason for our continuing trade deficits is simply that American consumers are spending too much. They've been overspending, and largely Asian consumers have been arguably spending too little. When you have big current account balances, when Americans are buying more than they produce in aggregate, that necessarily leads to a trade deficit. So I mean, part of what's been happening is that very kind of big picture question, or that very kind of big picture phenomenon rather. Rajan is interesting because he says, the problem is, well, it's twofold. One, both for structural and cultural reasons, it's harder than you'd think to, for many Asian countries to stimulate domestic consumption. Japan has now tried to do it for many years, and with only limited success, for instance. So kind of encouraging lower savings and more consumption in Asia is very important, ultimately to our trade balance and to jobs in the U.S. It's also very difficult. Rajan's other point is because the U.S. has a fairly limited, because it's democracy and has a limited safety net, unlike, say, China, autocracy, and Europe, good safety net. The rest of the world just kind of sits. It kind of expects that the U.S. will continue to outspend its income. So Asia doesn't really necessarily, China doesn't necessarily think it really needs to decrease its savings because when unemployment is high in the U.S., it is a catastrophe, and it's something that ultimately, the Fed will address, the federal government will address, in a way that encourages greater indebtedness and continued consumption in America. So that's his perspective on this. I don't know if I entirely agree with it, but I do think that a lot of what's happening right now when we talk about trade deficits, people seem to focus quite a lot on manufacturing. More than manufactured goods, can be traded, of course, and I think a large part of the problem is just the fact that large parts of the world are kind of artificially suppressing consumer demand, while the U.S., at least until recently, has kind of artificially stimulated it.
Lady here, distinguished Wilson Center fellow. Here's that microphone.
Well, thank you for the introduction. My name is Joe Freeman, but you've already given my affiliation. I have two questions. The first is about the military. The military has traditionally been a route of upward mobility. Yet, from what I've read in the newspapers, it appears that homelessness and unemployment is greater among veterans than non-veterans. So, has it become a drag on upward mobility rather than an assist? Does that change? That's question number one. Question number two concerning women. Again, the data I've read is that while men lost jobs during the recession, as jobs have come back, they've basically gone to men. Women's status, women have not been a beneficiary of the stimulus programs, men have. And the cuts, women are heavily employed in the public service sector, and the cuts that states are currently making in their various public service budgets appear to be impacting much more heavily on women. And I was wondering if you'd factor that into your analysis about the relative economic advantage of men and women.
Thanks. I can't comment on the military question. I simply don't know. I mean, as you said, historically, the military has been a great avenue for many people into a secure middle class life. And I just don't know, the extent to which that is becoming less true today. I don't know. As to women, you are right in that over the last year or so, men have recovered. Not only have they recovered faster than women have actually continued to lose jobs, which is an interesting and puzzling phenomenon, and is perhaps related to the specific nature of government job cuts, though I don't know that for sure. But those, so yes, I mean, women became a majority of the American workforce for the first time in American history, I believe, during the recession. It then flip-flopped for a while. Men have become a majority of the workforce again as they've regained some jobs. However, it's important to kind of keep the numbers in context. I mean, the numbers of jobs regained are I mean, they're puny relative to the number of jobs lost. And I think the overall secular trend of men and women and their work patterns, looks to be continuing. I wouldn't make too much of the last year of data, though I certainly would expect that over the next year or two, that general pattern will continue. That men will recover jobs at a faster rate than women, because construction will recover somewhat, manufacturing will recover somewhat. I just wouldn't expect that you'll see anything like a full recovery on those massive job losses that we saw from 2007 to 2009.
But have you factored the public employment part in? That's what I'm really getting at. Because those jobs look like they might be gone much longer than a year or two.
I mean, I haven't into a specific. I mean, I haven't done a specific analysis of job, of projected job gains by sector. I haven't done that. No.
The gentleman here.
My name is Bill Barnes. I'd like to get you to talk a little bit about the sort of the public discussion going forward. On the one hand, to talk about power, not about policy, but about the Jacob Hacker argument about the plutocracy, or whatever that word was, sort of getting their bit, not just by economic means or what you might call purely economic means, but by policy, politics, the rules of the game, and so on. You mentioned this issue before in terms of the people who run things kind of not having a national allegiance. Robert Reich wrote about that many years ago, about the withdrawal of an elite from national allegiance. So anyway, what's your view about the Jacob Hacker argument, the book that he wrote? I forget, the Winner Take All Politics, I think. And secondly, if you overlay the list of problems and solutions that you've done, you overlay them, are there 2 or 3 foci there? It's become such a long list of policy options, and that it's hard for me. My brain isn't good enough to keep going. So I'm looking for clustering, and whether these overlay in such a way that there are 2 or 3 places where you think there is high leverage. And the reason I put these two together is how does the power and the policy focus relate? That's what so thank you.
Sure. Yes, I mean, I do think that there's a clear relationship between or an interrelationship between the rising wealth and income of a tiny sliver of Americans, their political influence, and then cycling back to kind of even stronger income and wealth gains for that group of people. I think you see that most particularly in finance itself, where we continue to see an industry in which people make a lot of money off of an implicit guarantee by the government that catastrophic losses will be swallowed by the government and by the taxpayer. So I mean there are many examples, I think, that certainly show that the rising income, the high and rising income of people at the very top of the economy is at least in part a function of their influence on the government. And I think, again, particularly in finance, I don't think that's anywhere near the whole of the story. I think that we're just seeing the evolution of the economy in a way that is likely to create larger winner-take-all effects. It is easier to start a company now. It's easier to get financing, and because markets are global, say a new product or a new service can find more consumers faster and can create fortunes faster. So I mean, I think that part of what's going on is politics. Yes, I think part of what's going on is just the evolving nature of the global economy and the widening of markets. And I think there is a continuing, though this is not so much true this has less to do with the super elite, but there is a continuing and still increasing return to high skill, again, because of the nature of the direction of technology. I think all of those factors are important in explaining the evolving plutonomy, as you will, and I guess as far as thinking about recovery, let me say two things. Even as we've kind of separated from one another economically and the middle class has begun to hollow, there's also been kind of a geographic sorting that we've seen really over the past 20 years especially. You know, rich people, well-educated people increasingly live nearby one another and regionally increasingly live in a relatively small number of power cities and creative enclaves across the country. Washington, D.C. is certainly one of them. It's not that there are no poor people in these areas, but you know, by any means, as we know in D.C. But you're seeing kind of both regionally and locally, I think, increasing kind of segregation in where people live as well. I think that tends to blind many professionals and many rich people to the struggles that that a lot of Americans are seeing today. And so yes, I mean, I think for a variety of reasons, influential and affluent people in DC and around the country are less concerned about job growth. They're more concerned about, you know, the long run deficit. They're more concerned about technological growth, and that has clearly been shaping our policies. And I think it's going to continue shaping them. You know, as to concrete things that we can do quickly in the short run, you know, I've talked very broadly about government spending and stimulus, continuing the payroll tax cut, I think, is very important. But I mean, I think specifically, we've been underinvesting in infrastructure for years in the U.S., and that shows itself in a variety of ways. Now, there is no better time really than now than to increase our infrastructure spending. That would create jobs directly, and I think it's the kind of thing that people could get behind because it is also an issue of national competitiveness. So I think that's important. Finally, I think again, and this is a fairly short-term thing, but again, going back to the geographic pattern of growth in the U.S. and of segregation. Areas like DC, greater DC, and including Baltimore, you know, greater New York, you know, these areas are coming back. You know, the unemployment rate is lower in these places. The ratio of job seekers to job openings is fairly low. The unemployment rate in Minneapolis is something like 6.5%. In Las Vegas, it's something like 14.5%. You know, there are huge differences right now. And I think one thing that we can do to help recover faster, and particularly to help the non-professional middle class, is to provide, say, low-interest loans to allow people who've gotten stuck, who own houses and who've gotten stuck in places like Las Vegas or Phoenix or Tampa, places that were previously middle-class meccas and have turned out to be, you know, really mirages. Targeted measures that can help people like you know, in those places move to more dynamic regions a little bit more easily, you know, is another strategy, I think, that that could help us get back on our feet a little bit faster and kind of restore mobility, you know, which is at an all-time low in the U.S. To its previous levels.
Gentleman there, right by the microphone.
Excuse me, Milton Kotler. I'm a American businessman in China for 11 years. If one views your two cardinal solutions with some dubiety, like more education, which is averaging $50,000 a year with room and board, unaffordable to Americans, with Purdue at 60% international students in the graduate school. All right. So higher education is unaffordable as a vehicle for Americans. It is not unaffordable for Chinese, Indians, and a lot of other rich. So in all expectation, I would say within a decade, our universities will be foreign. And it'll be a very good deal for the Chinese because they won't have to build a scientific university infrastructure when they can have ours much cheaper. Your second premise is fiscal stimulus. We've just gone through a period where one can question whether there can be or will be a fiscal stimulus. So if we take your two solutions and doubt them for the sake of argument, and of course always accept the premise that recovery is always possible at a certain price point, like $14 an hour or $8 an hour. I'm asking you, do you have a positive, optimistic, social paradigm for a United States that does not recover at today's or yesterday's middle class wage? So I'm asking for, is there a positive view of how we can become happy in a poorer society?
Right. I want to answer your main question just to clarify. I'm not saying that higher education is that's kind of one of the main, especially in the short term, one of the main solutions for the problems that we have right now. I mean, I think actually, while higher education overall is essential to any high-tech economy, I'm quite skeptical that we will be able to radically increase, the number of people who have college degrees, over the next 10, 20 years. So I'm actually not saying that's realistically a part of the solution. I mean a large part of the solution for us. Just to clarify. But yeah, but if I'm skeptical, your question. If we don't do fiscal stimulus, if the rate of innovation does not increase in the U.S., if things don't go right, is there a positive view? Well, I don't think it's a radically positive view. Certainly, again, I mean, we know from prior periods of long malaise that things tend to go wrong in society in those cases. They go wrong politically, and the character of society tends to change. Support for immigration tends to fall. Support for the poor tends to diminish. Things tend to become more mean-spirited generally. We saw that in the 1890s. We saw it in the 1970s. We've seen it in many periods. I mean, I guess the one, there are a couple of things that make me think that maybe it wouldn't be quite as bad as in those situations. You look at Japan today. Japan's just in the midst of about 2 decades of fairly anemic growth. The bedrock really hasn't heaved there. It remains a relatively stable place, so perhaps we're rich enough as a country now where we won't see the kinds of political problems and cultural problems that we've seen in the past, that European countries have seen in the past. I've got to say, though, I'm fairly skeptical of that. I mean, Japan is a very culturally homogenous country, and it's kind of sui generis. So I would be cautious of analogies to it. So I guess I'm not convinced that I don't think we're going to see revolution in the U.S. if growth remains low, over the next few years. But I don't see a very happy solution. I don't see a very happy scenario if we don't do something to recover faster.
We have time for just one more question, and it's got to be one that elicits a happy response, looking positively at the future. There is a positive gentleman with his hand up there.
Well, I may not be your person here. I find this very thought-provoking. On that note, I want to say it's a very positive session here. But I do have two misgivings. One is I think you gave your folks at Aspen a bit of a pass there because there have been maybe some improvements that globalization has brought about, but to be in short, you could say that they've exported plutonomy all over the world. I mean, there's a huge problem in both India and China, and with the rich Chinese taking their money to gamble in Macau, and tremendous impoverishment while few get rich in India. So I mean, I think the real issue of equalization in a way is one that the ILO points to with the concept of decent work, and maybe this gets to the question of the last question or two of how do you accommodate a global equalization, if you like. And it's not just a matter of wage levels here in the States, but certain manageable things. And to be optimistic, I think that if we can get this affordable health care through, that makes a tremendous difference in the overall standard of living because it takes such a huge risk element out of the ordinary worker's life. But the other area of misgiving is, and also relates to the previous questioners about emphasis on fiscal investment. And I think it's not just a notion, I would just ask if the solution, maybe this being optimistic, is not just large amounts of fiscal impetus as it is on very focused, targeted investment in public goods. Because it seems one of the real problems is that for all the talk about leaving taxes low so that the private sector can bring about recovery, the private sector is not really addressing matters of public good in any very systematic way. And if anything, what's happening in Congress is a tax on any public investment in public goods. You talked about infrastructure, but also the new economy of a new green economy, that's just being poo-pooed. When we look at our international standing in education, maybe not everyone can afford a college education, but we're seeing a crucial sector like international education, foreign languages, being eviscerated from the budgets. And even in something like high technology, where we're going to now have private companies giving tourist vacations in outer space at enormous cost. And Appropriations Committee is cutting the budget or trying to cut the budget for the next generation telescope. Public goods, I think maybe even narrow focus on that might be part of the answer to moving us in the right direction.
Well, let me try to spin this response as positively as I can. I do. I mean, I do think.
Real pressure.
No, I mean, I think that first of all, I mean, you've identified, these vast changes that are taking place in the global economy, and they're very disruptive to the U.S. and to the U.S. middle class. And we really, some people and some companies have adapted very well to that. The U.S. as a whole really hasn't so far. I mean, I do think in the long run, certainly in the long run, the rise of a global middle class will eventually redound to the benefit of the U.S. because there will be a lot more consumers. Their wages will rise. They are quickly rising in China and India and Brazil and elsewhere. So eventually, I think we'll see some of the intense wage pressure on the middle class that comes from globalization rather than technology abate. And we'll see larger markets for U.S. exports. It's going to take a while to get there, but I mean there is a future that I think is not only kind of good for humanity as a whole, but will carry some real benefits for the U.S. I think that in thinking about how we can respond to the uncertainties and the speed of change in the U.S. This doesn't really get to recovery from the recession itself, but you mentioned healthcare. There are a number of things that we can do to at least make life for most people a little bit more certain, a little bit less risky, a little bit more stable. Access to healthcare is a big part of that. a bigger EITC would be a big part of that. There's an interesting idea out there called wage insurance, which is simply, when people do lose their jobs, once they take a new job, if it's a much lower wage job, we kind of keep paying them, say, half the difference for a year or two, which makes downward mobility a little bit less jarring and actually encourages people to jump faster. There are a number of tactics, and I talk about them in my book. That independent of this recession can help, make life more stable as we continue to experience shocks in this economy. For right now, the things that you talk about direct kind of government intervention, I think the things that we can do, certainly infrastructure investment, aid to the states, just direct aid to the states to preserve state government jobs and local government jobs, firefighters, police, teachers. I mean, these are strategies that are available to us, right now. They can either preserve jobs directly or create them. I think they're very important, and they could make a real difference in mitigating further job losses and creating new jobs, quickly.
Just make a couple comments. We have opportunities to purchase Pinched outside. I may want to rename it Squeezed after this discussion. And we'd also like you all to join us for a reception. And I think we might persuade Don Peck to sign a few books, should there be an opportunity. Sure. And now please join me in a round of applause for a stimulating discussion.